The morning light filtered through the hospital blinds, casting long shadows across the sterile white floor. Charles sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Catherine's bed, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The steady beeping of monitors filled the silence between them, a mechanical heartbeat that had become the soundtrack of their new reality. Catherine lay motionless against the crisp hospital sheets, her once vibrant auburn hair now dulled and spread across the pillow like autumn leaves. The woman who had danced in their kitchen just months ago, spinning to old jazz records while making Sunday breakfast, now seemed so fragile that Charles was afraid even his breathing might disturb her rest. 3 days had passed since the accident. 3 days since their world had shifted on its axis, transforming from ordinary Tuesday morning routines into a nightmare of sirens, emergency rooms, and doctors speaking in hushed, careful tones. Charles had not left her side, surviving on vending machine sandwiches and the kindness of nurses who brought him fresh coffee when they thought he wasn't looking. The accident replayed in his mind like a broken record. Catherine had been driving to the farmer's market, something she did every Tuesday morning for the past 15 years. She loved selecting the ripest tomatoes, chatting with vendors who knew her by name, and bringing home fresh flowers to brighten their dining room table. It was such an ordinary thing, so beautifully routine, that Charles had barely looked up from his newspaper when she kissed his cheek goodbye. The call came 2 hours later. A teenager, texting while driving, had run a red light. Catherine's small sedan had taken a full impact on the driver's side. The paramedics said she was lucky to be alive, but looking at her now, Charles wondered what kind of luck this really was. Her body was broken in ways that seemed impossible to heal, and the doctors, with their careful medical language, had not offered much hope. Dr. Martinez, a kind woman with gentle eyes, had explained Catherine's condition to Charles multiple times. The traumatic brain injury was severe. There was swelling that might or might not go down. There were no guarantees, no timelines, no promises beyond the assurance that they were doing everything possible. Charles nodded each time, but the words seemed to bounce off him like rain on a window. The only thing that felt real was Catherine's hand in his, still warm but unresponsive to his touch. Their daughter Sarah had flown in from Seattle the night before, her eyes red from crying and exhaustion. She looked so much like her mother at 35 that it took Charles's breath away. Sarah had always inherited Catherine's stubborn optimism, her ability to find light in the darkest situations, but even she seemed diminished by the weight of what they were facing. "Dad, you need to eat something," Sarah had said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Mom wouldn't want you to waste away in this chair." Charles had nodded and accepted the sandwich she brought, but eating felt like a betrayal somehow. How could he enjoy food when Catherine couldn't even open her eyes? How could the world continue turning when his universe had stopped? The room was filled with flowers now. Arrangements from neighbors, colleagues, and friends who had heard the news. Catherine would have loved them, Charles thought. She had always said that flowers were nature's way of reminding people that beauty existed even in difficult times. The irony was not lost on him that she was surrounded by more flowers than their garden had ever held, and she couldn't see a single one. As afternoon melted into evening, Charles found himself talking to Catherine as if she could hear him. The nurses had said it was possible that hearing was often the last sense to fade. So he told her about the calls they had received, about how their neighbor Mrs. Henderson was watering her beloved roses, about how the cat, Whiskers, was confused and kept looking for her by the kitchen window where she used to sit and read. "Remember when we got Whiskers?" Charles said softly, stroking her hand. "You said we were too old to start with a kitten, but you fell in love with him the moment you saw him at the shelter. You always had such a soft heart for strays." He paused, watching her face for any sign of recognition, any flutter of her eyelids that might indicate she heard him. There was nothing, just the peaceful expression she had worn for 3 days, as if she was simply sleeping deeply and might wake up any moment asking for her morning coffee. The memories came in waves, each one more vivid than the last. Charles remembered their first meeting 42 years ago at a bookstore downtown. Catherine had been reaching for a copy of Pride and Prejudice on a high shelf, and Charles, working up the courage to talk to the beautiful woman with the infectious laugh, had offered to help her. They had ended up talking for hours over coffee at the little cafe next door, discussing books and dreams and the way the afternoon light made everything seem possible. Their courtship had been a series of small, perfect moments. Walks through the park where Catherine would stop to pet every dog they encountered. Sunday mornings when she would read him passages from whatever novel she was enjoying. The way she hummed while cooking dinner, completely unconscious of the habit, but filling their home with gentle music. They had married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Catherine's parents' backyard. Charles still remembered how she looked walking toward him through her mother's rose garden, wearing a simple white dress and carrying wildflowers she had picked that morning. She had been radiant with happiness, and Charles had felt like the luckiest man alive. Sarah had come along 3 years after that, a perfect combination of both parents. She had Catherine's curiosity and Charles's steady nature, though she definitely inherited her mother's tendency to cry during movies and her father's inability to remember where he put his keys. Watching Catherine become a mother had been like watching someone discover they had wings. She approached parenthood with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else, reading countless books, joining playgroups, and turning their home into a place where creativity and laughter flourished. The years had passed in a blur of soccer games, school plays, family vacations, and quiet evenings when it was just the three of them around the dinner table sharing stories about their days. Charles had always thought they had time. So much time to make more memories, to travel to places they had talked about visiting, to simply enjoy growing old together. Catherine had retired from her job as a librarian just 6 months ago, full of plans for the garden she wanted to expand and the novel she had always talked about writing. Charles was supposed to retire next year, and they had spent countless evenings planning their future. They wanted to visit Sarah more often, maybe spend winters somewhere warm, and finally take that trip to Ireland that Catherine had dreamed about since she was a girl. Now those plans felt like fragments of someone else's life, dreams that belonged to people they used to be before this hospital room became their entire world. Charles wondered if this was what people meant when they talked about life changing in an instant. One moment you're complaining about ordinary things like traffic or rainy weather, and the next you're bargaining with God for just one more conversation, one more shared meal, one more chance to say all the things you thought you had forever to express. As the sun began to set outside the hospital window, painting the room in shades of orange and pink that Catherine would have loved, Charles leaned closer to her ear. "I'm here, sweetheart," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens, we're in this together, just like we've always been." The monitors continued their steady rhythm, and somewhere down the hall, Charles could hear the distant sounds of the hospital continuing its work. Life was going on all around them, but in this room, time seemed suspended, waiting for something that might never come. Charles closed his eyes and tried to remember the sound of Catherine's laugh, the way it could fill a room and make everyone around her smile without knowing why. He held on to that sound like a lifeline, knowing that no matter what tomorrow brought, some things were too beautiful to ever truly lose. Outside, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and Charles made the same wish on each one. Just a little more time. Just enough for one more conversation, one more shared smile, one more chance to tell her everything his heart had been saving up to say. The night stretched ahead of them, filled with uncertainty and hope in equal measure. Charles settled deeper into his chair, his hand never leaving Catherine's, and prepared to wait for as long as it took. In a world that seemed to have forgotten how to stand still, their love remained constant, a quiet rebellion against the chaos that threatened to consume everything they had built together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and new fears to face. But tonight, they were simply Charles and Catherine, husband and wife, facing the unknown together, just as they had promised to do 40 years ago in a rose garden filled with wildflowers and infinite possibility. The second week brought a cruel routine that Charles had never imagined could exist. Each morning, he would arrive at the hospital before sunrise, armed with fresh coffee and a desperate hope that today would be different. Each evening, he would leave only when the nurses gently insisted, carrying the weight of another day without progress back to their empty house. Catherine's condition had stabilized, the doctors explained, which was both a blessing and a curse. Her vital signs remained steady. Her body was healing from the physical trauma, but the brain injury that kept her locked away from the world showed no signs of improvement. Dr. Martinez spoke in careful medical terms about recovery timelines and realistic expectations, but Charles heard only the spaces between her words, the things she wasn't saying about hope and miracles and the woman he loved. Sarah had extended her stay indefinitely, taking a leave of absence from her job in Seattle to be with her parents during this impossible time. She had always been practical, the one who handled crises with lists and careful planning, but this situation defied all the organizational skills in the world. Instead, she found herself learning the rhythms of the hospital, memorizing which nurses were the kindest and which vending machines had the least terrible coffee. I keep waiting for her to open her eyes and ask why we all look so serious, Sarah told Charles one afternoon as they sat together in Catherine's room. She hated when people were too somber. Remember how she used to say that life was too short to waste time being sad about things you couldn't change? Charles smiled at the memory. Catherine had always been the family optimist, the one who found silver linings in storm clouds and beauty in the most ordinary moments. Even during Sarah's difficult teenage years, when their daughter had tested every boundary and challenged every rule, Catherine had maintained her faith that love and patience would eventually win the day. She had been right, of course. Sarah had grown into a wonderful woman, kind and strong and fiercely loyal to the people she cared about. The hardest part was the silence. Charles had never realized how much of his daily happiness came from the simple pleasure of talking with Catherine. They had been those couples who never ran out of conversation, who could spend hours discussing everything from the books they were reading to the neighbor's new fence to their dreams for the future. Now, the one-sided conversations he attempted fell hollow and strange, his voice echoing in the sterile room like a prayer with no answer. Friends and family visited regularly, bringing food and flowers and carefully cheerful conversation. Catherine's sister Margaret drove up from Florida, spending long afternoons knitting by the bedside and sharing memories of their childhood. Their longtime neighbors, Bob and Helen, stopped by daily with updates about the street and the small community Catherine had loved so much. Everyone seemed to understand that keeping Catherine connected to the world she knew was important, even if she couldn't participate in it. But it was the quiet moments that affected Charles most deeply. In the early morning hours, before the hospital fully came to life, he would hold Catherine's hand and study her face for any sign of the woman he had shared his life with. Sometimes he thought he saw a flicker of movement behind her closed eyelids, or felt her fingers respond to his touch, but the medical equipment told a different story. Her body was present, but Catherine herself seemed to be somewhere far away, somewhere beyond the reach of love or hope or desperate prayers. The medical team had begun discussing long-term care options. Words like rehabilitation facility and extended care floated through conversations that Charles only half heard. The social worker, a kind young man named David, spoke gently about quality of life and difficult decisions, but Charles wasn't ready for any of it. How could he make plans for a future that didn't include Catherine's voice, her laughter, her gentle presence, filling their home with warmth? One evening, as Charles was preparing to leave for the night, he encountered another family in the hospital corridor. A young couple with a newborn baby were walking slowly down the hall. The new mother, still moving carefully after her delivery, the father carrying their tiny daughter like she was made of spun glass. The sight of them, beginning their journey together while his own seemed to be ending, hit Charles with unexpected force. He found himself thinking about time differently now. All those years when he had assumed that tomorrow was guaranteed, when he had put off conversations or postponed small gestures of affection because there would always be another opportunity. He remembered times when he had been impatient with Catherine's stories about her day, or when he had been too tired to really listen to her excitement about a new book or a flower blooming in their garden. Those moments felt like enormous losses now, opportunities for connection that he had carelessly wasted. Dr. Martinez found him in the family lounge one afternoon, staring out the window at the parking lot where ordinary life continued its relentless pace. She sat down beside him with the easy familiarity of someone who had delivered difficult news many times before. "I know this is incredibly hard," she said quietly, "but I want you to know that Catherine is not suffering. The brain injury means she's not experiencing pain or distress. In some ways, she's simply sleeping very deeply." Charles nodded, grateful for the kindness in her voice. "I keep thinking about all the things we never got to say to each other. Not big things, just everyday things. How much I loved watching her tender flowers, or the way she hummed when she was happy. I never told her enough how much those little things meant to me." Dr. Martinez was quiet for a moment before responding. "From what I've observed, love isn't really about the big declarations we make. It's about showing up every day, caring for each other through ordinary moments. You've been here every day since the accident, Charles. That speaks louder than any words ever could." The observation stayed with Charles as he returned to Catherine's room. He looked at her peaceful face and realized that their entire marriage had been built on exactly that foundation of daily love. The way Catherine always made his coffee a little stronger than she preferred because she knew he liked it that way. How Charles had learned to enjoy romantic comedies because they made Catherine laugh. The 1,000 small accommodations and considerations that had woven their lives together into something beautiful and strong. That night, instead of recounting the day's events or sharing news from home, Charles decided to tell Catherine about their life together. He started at the beginning with that first afternoon in the bookstore and slowly worked his way through their shared history. He told her about their wedding day, how nervous he had been walking down the aisle, how radiant she had looked in the morning light. He described Sarah's birth, the way Catherine had cried with joy when she held their daughter for the first time, how they had spent hours just watching their baby sleep. "Remember when Sarah took her first steps?" Charles said softly. "You were so excited that you called everyone we knew. You made me video the whole thing, even though it was just 3 wobbly steps across the living room. But you said it was the most amazing thing you'd ever seen, and you were right. Everything was amazing when I saw it through your eyes." As the hours passed, Charles found himself remembering details he hadn't thought about in years. Their first apartment with the leaky faucet and the neighbor who played music too loud, but also brought them homemade cookies when they were sick. The year they tried to grow tomatoes on their fire escape and ended up with exactly 3 tiny tomatoes that they photographed like precious jewels. The way Catherine always left little notes in his lunchbox, sometimes just drawings or silly jokes that would make him smile during difficult workdays. The night nurse, a gentle woman named Patricia who had worked at the hospital for 20 years, stopped by to check Catherine's vitals around midnight. She had been listening to Charles's quiet monologue from the doorway. "I've seen a lot of families in situations like this," she said softly. "But what you're doing, sharing all these memories with her, it's beautiful. Love like yours doesn't just disappear because someone can't respond. It becomes something bigger, something that exists outside of words and conscious acknowledgement." Charles looked at Catherine's serene face and felt a strange kind of peace settle over him. Perhaps Patricia was right. Perhaps the love they had built together over 4 decades was strong enough to transcend this terrible silence, to exist in the space between heartbeats and in the gentle pressure of hands that had held each other through every joy and sorrow their lives had contained. As dawn approached and the hospital began to stir with the quiet efficiency of shift changes, Charles continued his vigil. He talked about their trips together, the time they got lost driving through Vermont and ended up at a tiny bed and breakfast where they stayed for 3 days just because the owner was lonely and Catherine couldn't bear to leave her without company. He described their recent years together, how retirement had given Catherine time to pursue her writing dreams, how proud he had been when she finished her first short story, and how disappointed she had been when it was rejected by magazines. "You never gave up, though," Charles whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You always said that rejection just meant you hadn't found the right reader yet. You had such faith in everything, sweetheart. Such beautiful, stubborn faith that good things were always possible if you just kept trying." The sunrise painted the hospital room in soft gold, and Charles felt the familiar stir of another day beginning. Soon, Sarah would arrive with fresh coffee and the determined cheerfulness she wore like armor against despair. The medical team would make their rounds, checking charts and monitoring equipment with professional efficiency. The world would continue its relentless forward motion, carrying them all toward an uncertain future that felt impossible to imagine. But in the quiet moments before the day truly began, Charles held Catherine's hand and felt the steady rhythm of her breathing, the warm proof that she was still with him, still fighting her silent battle in whatever distant place her consciousness had retreated. He thought about the young couple he had seen with their newborn baby, just starting their journey together, and he said a quiet prayer that their love would have more time to grow and flourish than his and Catherine's had been given. Time, he had learned, was the most precious gift of all, and he would spend every remaining moment of it loving Catherine with everything he had, for as long as she would let him stay by her side. 3 weeks into their new reality, something shifted. Charles noticed it first in the way Catherine's breathing seemed to change, becoming shallower and more irregular. The monitors that had provided steady background music to their days began displaying numbers that made the medical team exchange concerned glances during their rounds. Dr. Martinez's visits became more frequent, her gentle explanations more carefully worded, though she never spoke directly about what everyone in the room seemed to understand was happening. Sarah had noticed it too, though neither she nor Charles talked openly about their observations. Instead, they found themselves speaking more softly around Catherine's bed, moving with the careful reverence people reserve for sacred spaces. The bustling efficiency that had characterized the earlier days of their vigil had given way to something quieter, more profound. It felt as though they were standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, waiting for a tide that might carry Catherine away from them forever. The flowers in Catherine's room had been refreshed multiple times, but now Charles found himself choosing them more carefully. He brought roses from their garden, the deep red ones she had planted when they first moved into their house 30 years ago. He placed them where she could smell their fragrance, even though he wasn't sure if she was aware of anything around her anymore. The small ritual gave him comfort, a way to connect her to the home and garden she had loved so deeply. Their minister, Reverend Walsh, had begun visiting more regularly. He was a kind man who had known Catherine and Charles for over a decade, who had watched Sarah grow up, and had shared countless Sunday morning conversations with Catherine about faith, doubt, and the complicated business of living a good life. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false hope, but instead sat quietly with them, sometimes reading poetry that Catherine had loved or simply being present in the way that only old friends can be. Catherine always said that the most important thing wasn't understanding everything about faith, Reverend Walsh told Charles one afternoon. She said it was about trusting that love is stronger than anything else we encounter. She had such a clear sense of what mattered most. Charles remembered those conversations Catherine had shared with him over Sunday dinners. Her faith had never been simple or unquestioning, but it had been deep and genuine, rooted in a belief that kindness and compassion were sacred acts that connected all human beings to something larger than themselves. She had found God in ordinary moments, in the way sunlight fell across their kitchen table, and in the satisfaction of helping a neighbor with their garden. Her spirituality had been practical and generous, focused more on how to live well than on what to believe. The nights had become more difficult. Charles would doze fitfully in the chair beside Catherine's bed, waking frequently to check on her breathing or to adjust her blankets. The hospital never truly slept, but the overnight hours had their own rhythm, quieter and more contemplative than the busy days. It was during these late-night hours that Charles felt closest to Catherine, as though the darkness and silence created space for the deeper connections that daylight sometimes obscured. One night, around 3 in the morning, Charles was awakened by a change in the room's atmosphere. Catherine's breathing had become even more labored, and her face, which had maintained its peaceful expression for weeks, seemed somehow different. More fragile, perhaps, or more distant. Charles called for the nurse, his heart racing with an urgency he couldn't quite name. Patricia, the night nurse who had become a comforting presence during their long vigil, arrived quickly. She checked Catherine's vitals with gentle efficiency, her expression carefully neutral. After a few minutes, she pulled Charles aside for a quiet conversation in the hallway. "Her body is getting tired," Patricia said softly. "This isn't unexpected, given the severity of her injuries, but I think it's time to call Sarah, and maybe anyone else who would want to be here." The words hit Charles with a finality that 3 weeks of medical uncertainty had somehow failed to convey. This was it then, the moment they had all been dreading while secretly hoping it would never arrive. Catherine was leaving them, and there was nothing anyone could do to change that reality. Sarah arrived within 20 minutes, her face pale and her hands shaking slightly as she took her place on the opposite side of Catherine's bed. Margaret, Catherine's sister, was called and began the drive up from Florida, though they all understood she might not arrive in time. Bob and Helen, their neighbors, came to sit in the family lounge, wanting to be nearby without intruding on the family's final moments with Catherine. As the early morning hours stretched on, Charles found himself experiencing a strange kind of clarity. The desperate hope that had sustained him for weeks gradually gave way to something deeper and more peaceful. This wasn't the ending he had wanted for Catherine, for their marriage, for the life they had built together, but it was the ending they had been given. His job now was not to fight against it, but to help Catherine leave this world surrounded by love and dignity. "Tell me about the roses," Sarah said quietly, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Mom always said that her garden was like a diary of our family's history. She could remember exactly when she planted each variety and why." Charles smiled despite his grief, grateful for Sarah's gift of redirecting their focus toward celebration rather than loss. "She planted those red roses the week we moved into the house. You were only 5 years old, and you helped her dig the holes for the root balls. She said she wanted something beautiful to mark the beginning of our new life in that place." They talked about Catherine's garden for the next hour, sharing memories of summer evenings spent watering plants and autumn afternoons raking leaves. Charles told Sarah about how Catherine had taught him to appreciate the subtle differences between varieties of flowers, how she could identify birds by their songs, and how she had turned their simple backyard into a sanctuary that attracted butterflies and brought her endless joy. "She always said that gardens were lessons in faith," Sarah remembered. "You plant something small and trust that it will grow into something beautiful, even though you can't control the weather or prevent all the things that might go wrong." As morning light began to filter through the hospital window, Catherine's breathing became more shallow and irregular. Dr. Martinez arrived to check on her condition and spoke quietly with Patricia about adjustments to Catherine's comfort medications. The medical equipment that had monitored every heartbeat and breath for weeks was gradually turned down, its urgent beeping replaced by softer sounds that would allow the family to focus on Catherine rather than the machines that had sustained her. Margaret arrived just before noon, having driven through the night to be with her sister. She was exhausted and heartbroken, but her presence completed the circle of people who loved Catherine most. The women had been close throughout their lives, sharing the easy intimacy of sisters who had weathered childhood together and remained friends as adults. "She looks so peaceful," Margaret said through her tears, taking Catherine's hand. "Even as children, she had this quality of serenity about her. She was always the one who could calm everyone else down during family crises. Charles nodded, remembering Catherine's gift for bringing harmony to difficult situations. During their marriage, she had been the one who could defuse arguments with gentle humor or redirect tension into more productive conversations. She had never enjoyed conflict, but she had possessed an almost magical ability to help people find common ground and remember what they cared about most. As the afternoon wore on, the family settled into a quiet rhythm of shared presence and gentle conversation. They told stories about Catherine's life, remembering her childhood love of reading, her early career as a teacher before Sarah was born, and the way she had approached motherhood with such enthusiasm and dedication. Each memory seemed to add another layer to the portrait of a life well lived, a woman who had touched many people with her kindness and generosity. Reverend Walsh arrived in the evening, bringing with him a sense of spiritual comfort that seemed to settle over the room like a blessing. He read from Catherine's favorite psalms and offered prayers that focused on gratitude for her life rather than grief over her leaving. His words created space for both sorrow and celebration, acknowledging the profound loss they were all experiencing while honoring the love that would survive Catherine's physical presence. Catherine often told me that she believed love was the only thing that truly lasted, Reverend Walsh said. She thought that every act of kindness, every moment of compassion, every gesture of love created something permanent in the world. She believed that the love she gave and received would continue long after her physical presence ended. As night fell again, Charles settled into his familiar position beside Catherine's bed. Sarah curled up in the second chair, unwilling to leave her mother's side, while Margaret dozed on the small couch by the window. The room felt sacred now, filled with the weight of love and memory and the profound mystery of life transitioning into whatever came next. Charles held Catherine's hand and whispered stories about their life together, continuing the practice he had maintained for weeks. But now his words felt different, less desperate, and more like a gentle release. He told her about the beauty she had brought into his life, about the countless ways she had made him a better person, about the legacy of love she was leaving behind in Sarah and in the many people whose lives she had touched. "I understand if you need to go, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice breaking with emotion. "I don't want you to, but I understand. You fought so hard, and you've been so brave. If you're tired, if you're ready, then I want you to know that it's okay. We're going to be okay. We're going to miss you every day for the rest of our lives, but we're going to be okay because of everything you taught us about love." Catherine's breathing had become so shallow that each exhale seemed like it might be her last. Charles could feel the weight of the moment settling around them, the sense that they were standing at the threshold between one chapter of their lives and another. Soon, he would have to learn how to exist in a world without Catherine's presence. But for now, he was still her husband, still holding her hand, still connected to her by the bonds they had forged over 4 decades of shared life. The monitors showed that her heart was still beating, but Charles could sense that Catherine was already beginning her journey toward whatever waited beyond this room, beyond this life they had built together. He squeezed her hand gently and prepared to love her through whatever came next, determined to make these final moments as peaceful and beautiful as everything else they had shared. The final hours arrived with a quietness that seemed to fill every corner of the hospital room. Catherine's breathing had become so faint that Charles had to lean close to her face to confirm she was still with them. Her heartbeat, displayed on the monitor in gentle green waves, showed a rhythm that was growing weaker but remained steady, as if her body was carefully orchestrating its own peaceful departure. Sarah had fallen asleep in the chair beside her mother's bed, her hand resting protectively on Catherine's arm. Margaret dozed fitfully on the couch, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline that had sustained her during the long drive from Florida. The room felt suspended in time, existing in a space between day and night, between life and whatever comes after between the love they had known and the grief they were about to discover. Charles had stopped trying to sleep. Instead, he used these precious final hours to memorize everything about Catherine that he could. The way her hair caught the soft light from the bedside lamp. The familiar curve of her hand, which had held his through 4 decades of joys and sorrows. The peaceful expression on her face, which seemed to suggest that wherever her consciousness had traveled during these past weeks, she had found some kind of serenity there. "I've been thinking about our first apartment," Charles whispered to Catherine, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. "Remember how tiny it was and how we had to move the kitchen table against the wall every night so we could pull out the sofa bed? You said it was cozy, but I think you were just being kind about the fact that we couldn't afford anything bigger." He paused, watching her face for any sign of response, though he had long since stopped expecting one. The ritual of talking to Catherine had become something he did for himself now, a way to process the magnitude of what they were losing while celebrating the richness of what they had shared. "You made it beautiful, though," he continued. "You always could do that, turn any place into a home just by being there. You hung those white curtains with the tiny flowers, and you found that old mirror at the thrift store that you painted blue. You said every place needed at least one thing that was completely impractical, but absolutely beautiful." Around dawn, Dr. Martinez made a quiet visit to check Catherine's condition. She moved with the gentle efficiency of someone who understood that these moments were sacred, conducting her medical assessment without disturbing the peaceful atmosphere that had settled over the room. When she finished, she spoke quietly with Charles in the hallway. "It could be hours, or it could be days," she said gently. "But I think it's time to prepare yourself. Her body is shutting down very gradually, which is a blessing. There's no distress, no pain. She's simply growing more tired, and eventually she'll be too tired to continue." Charles nodded, grateful for Dr. Martinez's honesty and kindness throughout this impossible journey. "Is there anything else we should be doing? Anything she might need?" "Just what you've been doing," Dr. Martinez replied. "Stay close to her. Talk to her. Let her know she's surrounded by love. That's the most important medicine we can offer now." When Charles returned to Catherine's room, he found Sarah awake and holding her mother's hand. Tears moved silently down her cheeks, but her expression was peaceful rather than anguished. She looked up at her father with eyes that held the same depth and compassion that Catherine had always possessed. "I was telling her about the baby," Sarah said softly, "about how we've been trying and how scared I've been about whether I'll be a good mother. I told her that I hope I can love my children the way she loved me, with that perfect balance of fierce protection and absolute trust." Charles felt his heart swell with pride and grief in equal measure. Sarah had always been Catherine's greatest achievement, a daughter who embodied the best qualities of both parents while developing her own unique strengths. The idea that Catherine might not live to meet her grandchildren was almost unbearable, but Charles found comfort in knowing that her legacy would continue through Sarah's love and guidance. "She'll be with you," Charles said, sitting down beside his daughter. "Not in the way we would want, but she'll be there in all the things she taught you about love and patience and finding joy in ordinary moments. She'll be there every time you comfort your children or help them discover something beautiful about the world." As morning progressed into afternoon, the family maintained their vigil with a kind of peaceful determination. They took turns sitting closest to Catherine, sharing stories and memories, sometimes lapsing into comfortable silence that felt as meaningful as words. Margaret talked about their childhood together, remembering Catherine's love of books and her early dreams of becoming a writer. Sarah shared memories of her teenage years, when Catherine had somehow managed to be both a supportive friend and a wise parent, offering guidance without judgment. Reverend Walsh returned in the early evening, bringing with him a sense of spiritual comfort that seemed to ease the weight of sorrow that pressed against their hearts. He offered prayers that celebrated Catherine's life while acknowledging the grief of those who would miss her. His words created space for both mourning and gratitude honoring the complexity of love that includes both joy in what has been shared and pain at what must be lost. Catherine lived with such intentionality, Reverend Walsh said during one of his prayers. She approached each day as an opportunity to love more deeply, to notice more beauty, to offer more kindness to the world around her. Her life was a testament to the power of quiet goodness, to the way one person's love can ripple outward to touch countless other lives. As the sun began to set outside the hospital window, painting the room in the soft golden light that Catherine had always loved best, Charles noticed another change in her breathing. It had become even more shallow and sporadic, with longer pauses between each breath. He could sense that they were approaching the final chapter of their long goodbye. "Sweetheart," Charles said softly, leaning close to Catherine's ear. "Sarah is here with us, and Margaret, and Reverend Walsh. We're all here, and we love you so much. You've been the most wonderful wife, the most amazing mother, the most beautiful friend anyone could ask for. You filled our lives with so much joy." Sarah moved to the other side of the bed, taking her mother's other hand. Margaret stood at the foot of the bed, her own tears flowing freely now. Reverend Walsh positioned himself near the window, offering quiet prayers that created a backdrop of spiritual comfort for what they all understood would be Catherine's final moments. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to her mother. "Thank you for showing me what it looks like to love someone completely. Thank you for all the bedtime stories and birthday cakes and patient answers to my endless questions. Thank you for believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Charles felt his own tears beginning to flow, but they were tears that somehow contained both heartbreak and gratitude. "Thank you for 42 years of loving me," he said to Catherine. "Thank you for making every day brighter just by being in it. Thank you for Sarah, and for our home, and for all the beautiful memories we created together." Catherine's breathing grew even fainter, and Charles could sense that she was getting ready to leave them. The monitors showed her heart rate slowing, but her face remained peaceful, as though she was simply falling into a very deep sleep after a long and satisfying day. "It's okay, sweetheart," Charles whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "We're going to miss you more than words can say, but we're going to be okay. We're going to take care of each other, and we're going to remember you every day. We're going to keep your garden blooming, and we're going to tell Sarah's children all about their amazing grandmother." The room fell into profound stillness, broken only by the soft sounds of their breathing and the distant hum of hospital activity in other parts of the building. Charles could feel the weight of this moment, understanding that he was witnessing something sacred and irreversible, the transition between life and whatever mysteries lay beyond. "Stay with me," Charles whispered, though even as he spoke the words, he could see that Catherine was already traveling towards something he couldn't follow. Her breathing had become so faint that he had to watch carefully to see the gentle rise and fall of her chest. And then, between one breath and the next, Catherine simply stopped. Her face remained peaceful, still wearing the serene expression that had characterized these final weeks, but the essential spark that had made her Catherine, the vibrant woman who had filled their lives with laughter and love and infinite tenderness, had quietly slipped away. The monitors registered the change with soft electronic sounds, but the family remained focused on Catherine herself, on the profound silence that had settled over her like a blessing. Charles continued to hold her hand, which remained warm for several more minutes, as though her love was reluctant to leave them completely. "She's free," Sarah said through her tears. "She's not trapped anymore. She's free." Dr. Martinez and Patricia arrived to confirm what everyone in the room already knew, conducting their final medical assessment with gentle respect for the family's grief. They spoke quietly about next steps and paperwork, but their words seemed to come from very far away. Charles could only focus on Catherine's peaceful face and the incredible silence that had replaced the sound of her breathing. In the hours that followed, as they made the difficult transition from active caregiving to the business of saying goodbye, Charles felt himself beginning to understand something about the nature of love and loss. The physical presence that had anchored his life for 4 decades was gone, but something deeper remained. The love they had shared, the kindness Catherine had brought into the world, the values she had modeled for Sarah and for countless other people whose lives she had touched, those things hadn't died with her body. They had become part of the fabric of who he was, who Sarah was, who everyone who had known Catherine would continue to be. As they finally prepared to leave the hospital room that had been their world for nearly a month, Charles looked back at the bed where Catherine had fought her final battle with such dignity and grace. "Thank you," he whispered one last time. "Thank you for everything." The sun had set completely now, and the room was filled with the soft darkness that Catherine had always said was the most peaceful time of day. Charles walked out into the hospital corridor holding Sarah's hand, carrying with him the weight of profound loss and the surprising lightness of profound gratitude. Catherine was gone, but she had left them with everything they needed to continue loving each other and the world around them with the generous, patient, beautiful love she had taught them was life's greatest gift. Tomorrow would begin the long journey of learning to live without her physical presence. But tonight, Charles felt surrounded by the love they had shared and sustained by the knowledge that some connections transcend even death itself. Catherine had whispered, "Stay with me," with her whole life, and he finally understood that love like theirs doesn't end just because eyes close and breathing stops. It becomes something larger and more permanent, woven into the very foundation of who they would continue to be, together and apart for all the days that lay ahead.